So with the fuel prices steadily increasing, times are getting tougher for consumers. A litre of petrol now costs 37 cents more, while diesel has dropped by 36 cents per litre. The working class is the hardest hit as the bulk of their paycheck goes to transport costs. To find out how taxi prices are determined, we are joined by the SANTACO National Spokesperson, Phala. Also joining us this morning is a senior data and analytics specialist at FinMark Trust, Jabulani Khumalo, who will speak to us more about the working class and how it is coping. Jabulani, good morning. Let's start off the conversation with you looking at the report, the survey that you've just issued. 85% of the living expenses of people is spent on items such as groceries, transportation, as well as communication. What are we noting about how consumers are spending their money?
Thank you, Aldrin, and a very good morning to you and your audience. Maybe firstly, let's just talk about the survey itself. It's called FinScope. The survey is conducted on an annual basis among 5,600 adults defined as 16 years and older. It is a national representative study, including all 9 South African provinces, covering people living in the rural and urban areas. The methodology is comprehensive to give a picture of 45 million adults population as per latest census report. And yes, indeed, what we are experiencing is that salaries and grants are not enough to cover the living cost. It is therefore not surprising in terms of what we are seeing, people borrowing money. Like, for instance, last year alone, this is about 17 million adults who mainly borrowed money to buy food. And this constitutes 31% of the income. So it's just spent in food and groceries.
Yeah. And on electricity, for instance, the report indicates that 20 million adults have gone without electricity because they could not afford it in the past 12 months. And if we look at the stats that you've just quoted in terms of the demographics of this particular population, that's nearly half of the entire country's adult population. Indeed.
If I can just break it down for you, in terms of the wallet share. Let me use an exaggerated example of a worker earning 11,000 a month. And I'm saying this is an exaggerated example because the FinScope data shows that the average monthly personal income in South Africa is 3,900. Now, from that 11,000, 1,320 will go to energy costs, including electricity. As already painted out, the other 31% will be around 3,500, which goes to food and grocery. And 1,800 will go to transport and communication. This is now around 60% of worker salary. It is not surprising that 67% of those earning between 10,000 and 20,000 do not have a retirement product because 84% of salaries goes to the living costs.
Yeah, and Rebecca, the stats, they're going to say that 11.5% is spent on transportation. I want to bring you into this conversation now because the taxi industry plays quite a critical role in steering the economy and ensuring that the economy is active, making sure that the working class do actually make it to work. 11.5% is a lot of money that they do spend on transportation costs. Let's first start with how you, as the taxi industry, determine the fees and how the fees are hiked.
Thanks, Aldrin. Good morning, and to the viewers. The taxi industry uses what we call the taxi fare index. It's a policy that has been adopted for as long as the taxi industry has been formally constituted, dating back to 2001. And that fare index essentially guides that taxi associations, one, it is their prerogative to determine when they would like to increase fares, but the fare index largely says that around July every year, taxi associations should effect increases, and it also guides that it should ideally be once a year. And this obviously policy-wise is something that was adopted before the state of the economy was where it is now, and it's one of the issues that will be central to the upcoming SANTACO Policy Conference, considering the state of the economy and how things tend to fluctuate. Essentially, what we do in terms of percentages is that associations are guided and urged to not effect increases that go beyond between 1% and 5% of what commuters are paying at a particular route in terms of the fares. So that's what we use to guide us.
Yeah. With that said, though, those recommendations are merely recommendations and guidelines. They are not binding on the taxi associations, because sometimes a taxi association can decide that actually they want to go against the advice that's coming from the index.
So the index is binding. It is it's a policy that is within the working that we do as an industry. But I think one of the reasons why we're going into this conference is that we're seeing, like you rightly say, it's not necessarily distinct in terms of giving an exact directive of what should be done, and also guiding in terms of the fluctuations that perhaps were not as wide and as unpredictable as they've come to be in present day. So yes, we do agree that it is not necessarily very certain, but the reality also on the ground, and the advice is often from the National Executive Committee, is that associations have not been increasing fares as and when there is an increase of fuel prices, because we are alive to the reality that when there is a decrease, you hardly ever will hear us saying we're decreasing, but also we don't want to chase our commuters away, because we're alive to the statistics that get to be released by, Statistics South Africa, and now this very, detailed one that we're discussing right now on this platform. So we factor some of those issues in, and to be quite honest, we actually haven't had a lot of mostly lucrative routes increasing their prices this year alone, because one, we're losing track in terms of the number of times that the Department of Mineral Resources has been talking about these increases, but also we understand that times are quite tough.
Yeah. Before we go to the impact that this is having on the taxi drivers as well as the taxi operators, would you say that this index is also binding to the National Taxi Alliance?
So it does not. It binds SANTACO members greatly. The National Taxi Alliance has got their own policies, yes.
Okay. So let's speak about what you just said now around the adjusting the taxi fares and so forth, and sometimes the impact that it could have on drivers. Speak to us about that.
Sure. Look, we've been having an engagement. In fact, just this week, the leadership of both SANTACO and the NTA have been meeting with financiers, all of the major banks, because we're realizing that the appetite to finance for especially new vehicles is starting to dwindle because of the state of the economy, but also even for the operators that do have vehicles that have been financed. Most of them have been struggling to make ends meet in terms of the payments. So we are greatly affected, and we're also having, conversations with institutions that would be involved in energy supply to see to it that we perhaps, considering the contribution that we're making to their businesses, could have some incentives that are being introduced, particularly targeted at our industry. But look, in terms of this recent hike, you would know that your Toyota Quantums, your Sprinters from Mercedes mostly use diesel, and obviously there has been a decrease in that particular regard. So at least a bit of a sigh of relief. But obviously, when you look at your meter taxis, which are the smaller cars, they still use petrol. So it's a bit of both in terms of how we're being affected. But more than anything, the industry is certainly feeling the burn.
Yeah, Jabulani, let's bring you in here. Do you think that an introduction of making sure that, for instance, that the taxi industry is also funded, that it gets the subsidy that was actually proposed and recommended by the Competition Commission, could actually lessen the burden on the commuter at the end of the day?
I strongly believe so, because we all know that the increase in the price of fuel deepens the living crisis for workers and remain a burden as the ripple effect is felt in the prices of basic needs and services. This has a direct impact on food costs, transport, and other essentials. So, indeed.
Yeah. What other recommendations do you think the public transport industry should actually be looking at?
For me, already it's that a subsidy. But also, I really don't think the burden really relies with them, because I strongly believe that as a country, we need to support our ailing economy. FinScope data showed that the formal sector since 2003 grew with only 2.3% compared to adult population, which grew at 66%. So people who fail to make it in the formal sector either remain unemployed and depend on the government grants and family members, or they are observed by informal sector, which grew by 112% 603. So for me, I think this is a sector that we need to look at it, because despite its importance, the South African informal sector is relatively small, accounting for only 19% of total adult population compared to the informal sector in peer group countries. So I strongly believe that, no, this is a sector that we need to focus as a financial sector, but as a country as a whole. The data also shows that around 7 million adults in 2023 wanted to invest or start their own businesses. Therefore, we need to support the informal sector, stop criminalizing it, design insurance and retirement products that meet the needs of informal employees. And I think in this sense, really will be able to increase the salaries that they are getting, and then they'll be able to afford the living costs, but also not only that, they'll be able to invest their money in the developmental needs.
Yeah. Rebecca, the point that I was raising now on the Competition Commission report, what it finds as well is that the finance models and agreements that the taxi industry sometimes go in with some of the financiers are so burdensome that some of the taxi operators are struggling to pay back the financial institutions. SA Taxi, I think, was one of those institutions that was listed as well. Considering how reliant the South African economy is on the taxi industry, why is South Africa not manufacturing its own taxis?
Well, good question, Aldrin. I think perhaps we may need a bigger time and also bring in the OEMs to also give in their own perspective in terms of local production of vehicles. I do not necessarily, though, think in the greater scheme that if vehicles were to be produced locally, they would do difference in terms of issues of pricing, because you would understand in the general sense the kind of capacity that we have as a country, especially in terms of manufacturing. But I think it's a conversation that needs to be had. And look, in terms of the issue of financing...
But wouldn't it bring down the original equipment manufacturer's cost, for instance, if the equipment are being manufactured locally?
The question is, what capacity do we have as a country to even manufacture equipment, right? And the kind of costing that would be had. I think generally what I am saying is that even if we were to manufacture locally, you would find that a lot of what is being used would still be reliant on, external factors and external manufacturers. But I think it would be very important to maybe get a perspective of OEMs or these institutions that are responsible for vehicle sales and things of that sort, to get an understanding of what the reality is on the ground. But there is an appetite, without a doubt. I think the reason why you see the taxi industry warming up to an institution like SA Taxi, which was essentially tailoring these services to the industry, shows you that there is an appetite to support something that is not off the shelf and sort of used for everyone, but caters really for the industry in its distinct manner.
Okay, thank you so much for your time. Jabulani Khumalo there, as well as Rebecca Phala, who is the spokesperson for SANTACO. Appreciate your time.